Imagine running your way out of poverty. Literally. That is, if poverty is living on the equivalent of $1.70 per day. That's what Liang Jing was able to do. He supported his family of three by winning ultramarathons. I'm sure you're familiar with traditional 26-mile marathons, but an ultramarathon is so much more than that. I can barely make it 1 mile. I was a sprinter for a reason when I ran track, but Liang Jing and runners like him run up to 100 miles in ultramarathons. And when he won, he made money. Liang used to be a delivery worker and a technician at a dairy company. But when he discovered he could make more money running than at his job, he quit. In 2015, there was a boom in marathons in China, and Liang was so successful at winning that the other runners called him Liang the Legend. He was really good at it and at his peak in everything. In 2020, the Communist Party chief at Jingtai County hung a medal on Liang's neck and shook his hand in congratulations after he won a 62-mile mountain race in Jingtai for the third year in a row. The party chief praised the races for helping his county out of poverty, because that month, on the third annual race, they were brought above the poverty line. Tourists visiting the race, the runners themselves, and the media attention it attracted all helped with reviving the economy. Because even though it was in the manufacturing center of coastal China, that particular county was still struggling. So the party chief encouraged the runners to set more records and do more to bring people to the area. Liang said in an interview, "I hope everyone comes to travel here. We have beautiful sceneries too." But the next year, during the fourth Gansu Ultramarathon, Liang would be among 21 other runners who would freeze to death during the race. And the party chief, who I'll call Mr. Li, would be the face of the disaster. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is Occurrence. Before I get into it, all sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information. Without further ado, the Jingtai Ultramarathon was a joint effort. From 2018 to 2021, the city sports department in Gansu province and the Jingtai County Communist Party committee worked together to organize the event. Provinces in China are similar to states in America. Since the race took place in the Yellow River Stone Forest, the on-field event coordinator was the administration for that forest, and that was headed by Mr. Li. The actual race operator was a sports culture development company that was local. And this edition of the race had 3 events: a 5K, a half marathon, and a 62-mile or 100-kilometer trail race. To participate in the 62-mile race, runners had to show proof of completing similar races at least half of that distance within the previous year. There were so many reasons people wanted to join the race, from the local community and from the government. Bayan City, the host of the race, was best known for being the crawling ground for China's most known serial killer, called the Chinese Jack the Ripper. He killed 11 women between the 1980s and early 2000s, and honestly, the ultramarathon gave the city a chance to improve its reputation and give the local government the revenue that it needed. One of the runners in the race, who I'll call Z, was once a doctor in a hospital in Gansu's capital. Now, China used to have their one-child policy where families could only have one child to help slow down the rapid population growth. It was enforced through various means, but Z lost her job because she had a second child. So she was forced to return to the countryside, and she made a living by buying 200 pounds of vegetables from a wholesale market every morning and then hauling it on foot to sell it to the surrounding villages. She would work for 12 hours a day and would make the equivalent of under $5. I mean, can you imagine the labor involved in hauling hundreds of pounds of vegetables around, trying to get people to buy them, pulling 12-hour shifts, and cost of living difference aside, That's just an incredible amount of work to the proportion of money she made. So in 2016, when she was handed a flyer for a half marathon in Gansu's capital, and she saw that the first 20 people to finish would win 200 yuan, which is the equivalent of $31, she signed up. She joined races all around the province and then all over China. She ended up becoming the main moneymaker in her family, making up to 40,000 yuan a year, which is around 6,000 American dollars. Now, I mentioned the cost of living difference before, because while that seems like a small amount in America, in China it was enough for Z to put both of her children through school. And as long as she made sure she finished every race in time to get home that evening, so she wouldn't have to pay for a hotel room, it was enough for her family to survive. So when the next Gansu Ultramarathon came around, of course she entered into it. The first place finisher in the Ultramarathon would win 15,000 yuan, the equivalent of $2,324. Second place was around $1,800, and third place was around $1,400. Anyone who finished before the 20-hour cutoff time would win $247. With so many participants in the race, with stories like Z, the Ultramarathon was a potential gold mine. Now, there was a steep registration fee. It was $155, but they were guaranteed to make something back as long as they finished before the cutoff time, regardless of the obstacles during the race. Tragically, when Z's remains were found in the Yellow River Stone Forest, she would be found still wearing the $4 pink shoes she bought 5 years earlier for her first half marathon in the province capital. Those shoes were the only piece of running gear she ever purchased and didn't get for free at a race. There were so many stories like this, where people got good at running because their lives and their families' lives literally depended on it, and the local government depended on those races for the revenue. But there were two sides to the prize money. There were the runners who obviously wanted to win because they needed the money, and they couldn't risk withdrawing because then it would put their livelihoods at stake. On the other side, there's the organizers for the race, because the fewer people that finish, the less they would have to pay out at the end, and the more they could keep to themselves, which would obviously give them incentive to make the races more and more challenging every year. And because of that, this year, the organizers decided on a new route to take through the remote mountain territory in the Yellow River Stone Forest. The track is a natural mountainous route that hadn't been artificially hardened and was a mixture of sand, gravel, and grass. The starting line was at an elevation of around 5,200 feet, with 9 checkpoints all along the trail. The third checkpoint at the summit was 7,320 feet high, and the most rugged and narrow sections were around the second and third checkpoint. Both of those locations were not able to be reached by car, and to make it there from the nearest road under the best weather conditions, it would require a 1 to 2 hour walk. For some reason, most of the checkpoints had multiple volunteers, multiple medical staff, and at least one ambulance, but checkpoint 3 only had 2 volunteers there, and it wasn't a supply point. The rest of the checkpoints have anywhere from 4 to 8 volunteers on top of 3 to 6 medical staff, and at least 1 ambulance on top of that. And they're also supply points. Checkpoint 3 is literally just the 2 volunteers. And on top of that, around checkpoint 2 and 3 were signal blind spots. Phones couldn't connect to the cell towers to make calls or text or anything like that. The night before the race, the weather was good. So the organizers offered to take the runners' night supplies and put them at the 6th checkpoint, which was around the halfway mark. They would be able to pick it up during the race the next evening. For the last 3 years, the weather was sunny and hot during the race. So most of the runners handed away their extra clothing, like their windbreakers. May 22nd, the morning of the race, it was cold, but the sun was shining. There were 172 runners for the Ultramarathon, and most of them showed up wearing vests and shorts. While they were warming up at the starting line, They were a little worried by the cloudy overcast and the wind. But when the mayor of Bayin fired the starting pistol at 9 a.m., everyone took off. Now, all of the runners were given GPS devices by the local sports marketing company that was operating the race. During the Ultramarathon, the other races were happening too. So, the 5K run ended around 10:30, and the half marathon ended around 12:30 p.m. By 11 a.m., all of the ultramarathon runners passed checkpoint 1. 46 minutes later, 131 runners in the ultramarathon passed checkpoint 2. And 4 minutes after that, the first distress message was sent by a runner using the GPS they were given, but they never received a response. Around noon, the captain of the rescue team working the event received a report from a team member who was stationed at the stage. He was asking to withdraw because it was too windy and rainy, and it was making him weak and sick. The captain agreed to let him go and arranged for people to help him leave. Another 15 minutes goes by, and multiple distress messages were sent using the official WeChat message group. It was contestants and rescue team members asking for help. At 12:20 p.m., the supervisor for the sports company received a report that a contestant had withdrawn from the competition. So I'm guessing in anticipation of more withdrawals, the supervisor rented a vehicle to accommodate anyone else who withdrew from the race. 10 minutes later, a contestant sent a picture of 10 runners huddled together to try and fight off the cold to the official WeChat group. Just before 1 p.m., the Jingtai County Command Center received a call for help from a runner, so the police were sent for rescue. About 10 minutes after that, the rescue team worker who asked to withdraw earlier was suffering from hypothermia and unable to move because he was giving out protective equipment to the runners. I can only assume it took that long for the other rescuers to get to his location to replace him, but once the rescuers showed up, they had to rescue him. So now it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the captain of the rescue team received a call from the supervisor of the sports company. He was asking for help to go up the mountain and rescue any exhausted contestants. So the supervisor immediately summoned all male team members to rush to the location and offered their support. A few minutes later, a huge number of runners withdrew from the competition, and so they decided to suspend the race. So several higher-ups working the event and others rushed to carry warm supplies to the rescue and coordinated ambulances and medical personnel to get to the area where the runners and workers were stranded and struggling. Now, even though the event organizers started implementing rescue operations, they didn't actually announce that they suspended the race. So anyone still running, which was pretty much the more elite runners who were ahead of everyone else, were not aware that the race stopped. So from the times of around 2:30 to 4:30, 4 runners made it past checkpoint 3. Around 3 o'clock, workers showed up at checkpoint 2 and realized that the weather was so severe that rescue would be very difficult. So they called for reinforcements and distributed materials like extra clothes to anyone injured and trying to turn around. And at this point, there's a lot of back and forth between the higher-ups running the event. They're trying to figure out the severity of the situation and figure out how bad things actually are. They come to the conclusion that, yeah, this is pretty bad. So they decided to formally report the incident to the county party committee and the county government. That's about the time that one of the directors received a phone call from a villager, because sometime before that, the Yellow River Stone Forest Administration called the mayor of a nearby town. He briefly said they needed to bring winter supplies to the athletes. So the mayor told the closest village at the foothill, but they didn't realize the urgency until another shepherd who just happened to be taking shelter uphill managed to get out of the signal blind spot and called the director. He told him that 2 runners were found lying on the ground, and it looked like they were dead. At that point, the villagers realized the situation was urgent and went out to help. At the same time, The worker that was coordinating transportation for runners in the race was contacted about someone that was stranded and injured around checkpoint 3. I'm going to call him K. So K was told to bring warm clothes and help the injured runner down the mountain. Now, before I told you, checkpoint 3 had 2 volunteers, but there have actually been several reports that say there were no volunteers there at all. It could be possible that they were there and then left when the weather turned bad. But anyway, when Kay got near the ridge, he saw smoke coming out of one of the small caves used by the local shepherds. They used them for shelter, so Kay went over to the cave, and when he looked inside, he saw 6 runners huddled around a fire, and they were all turning blue and shaking violently. There was an adjacent cave next to it that a local shepherd stepped out of, and he told Kay that he was out in the mountains because that morning his flock wanted to graze. While he was out there, he stumbled upon a runner struggling and helped him to the cave. He went back and found 4 others that he was able to direct down the mountain. He told Kay that there were more uphill, but he wasn't able to get back up there to help them. So Kay took off running through the wind, rain, and hail to where the shepherd said they were. After about 30 minutes of running, he saw a runner lying on the ground. At first, he looked like he was resting and exhausted. His eyes were squeezed shut, and he wasn't moving. But when Kay looked closer, he realized he wasn't breathing either. The bib number on the runner was number 1. It was Liang Jing, the running god, and everyone's favorite to win. It was shocking because Liang had shown that he was able to run 250 miles in 12 hours. But when they looked at the GPS data on his watch later, they realized that it was his slowest time ever. It took him around 50 minutes to run half of 1 mile. And in his final stretch, he was zigzagging, stumbling, and crawling off course, trying to find shelter. He passed checkpoint 2 before 11, but a few minutes after 1, his watch registered a heart rate of 0. By 3:30, Bayan City Fire Rescue Command Center received an alarm about the potential mass casualty event and immediately dispatched multiple fire trucks and dozens of men from the city and from all over the county. They even tried to get a rescue helicopter, but it was transferred to an area that suffered an earthquake and wasn't able to help at the Ultramarathon site. The reinforcements that were coming from the county and not locally didn't actually arrive at the car-accessible 4th checkpoint until around 5:45. And then they had to hike up to the 3rd checkpoint, which they wouldn't reach until around 9 p.m. During that huge gap of time, the rescue efforts continued. The city's emergency bureau launched emergency video dispatch and reached out to rescue teams familiar with large-scale events, like the National Mine Rescue Team. The local fire rescue carried life-saving equipment to checkpoints 2 and 4 for search and rescue. 296 police officers were sent to help too. One of the villagers who went out to help on a motorbike left around 4, and he ran into a runner who was foaming at the mouth around 6 or 7. Around that same time, 139 people were found and saved, or had returned, but there were still 33 people missing. So with people still missing, things now have to escalate. You can't keep this under wraps. People are still missing, others have already been found dead. It's time to bring in the big guns. So the Bayan Municipal Party Committee secretary tells the situation to the Provincial Party Committee secretary, who tells so on and so forth, until the governor is involved and the vice governor is involved, and the heads of any relevant departments are now made aware of what's been going on the past few hours. So they rush to the scene, and the military is deployed, and the province emergency services is deployed. I mean, they're deploying everyone humanly possible at this point. 60 men from the nearby village also hiked up to help at the 3rd checkpoint. They were all around 50 years old, and they wouldn't make it there until about 8 p.m. Now, when the county firefighters finally did show up, They brought thermal imaging drones and radar. But somehow they still managed to get lost in the dark and had to rely on the villagers for guidance. The villagers were more helpful to the runners suffering from hypothermia because they brought warm clothes and bedding. And the county firefighters weren't trained to identify hypothermia and didn't attempt CPR on anyone who, quote, looked dead. At 9:30, the first search and rescue teams of city firefighters rescued 4 trapped people near checkpoint 3. 3 were already dead, but 1 was still alive, in poor condition. Just before 10 o'clock, the captain of the Provincial Forest Fire Brigade, which again is the equivalent of the state sending these people, sent 16 vehicles, 122 commanders and firefighters, and they all rushed to the scene carrying over 600 sets of rescue equipment, including things like night vision and first aid kits. They're sending satellite communication vehicles, satellite phones, everything they have, basically. The province governor is now involved, and other provincial leaders, and they establish an on-site command center. It has 7 departments responsible for comprehensive management, search and rescue, casualty treatment, and investigation. The province has completely taken over, and even with the province sending all of this equipment and people and help, I cannot stress how much had already been sent before they took that step. So now it's 1:30 a.m., and the fire department found the remains of 4 victims between checkpoints 2 and 3. By 2:30 that morning, search and rescue found 32 of the 33 people that were missing. 20 were confirmed dead, and 12 had been rescued. By 6 o'clock, they had multiple military aircrafts in the air to help with rescue and in moving remains. But it wouldn't be until a little after 9 a.m. on May 23rd that the last missing person would be found, and she had no vital signs. So it was confirmed that among the 172 runners, 151 were picked up or transferred to a safe area by search and rescue. 8 of those were injured and treated in a hospital, and 21 were killed. It was around that time that a runner named Mr. Liu's 21-year-old daughter started receiving videos from Douyin, which is China's TikTok. They were from her friends and members of the running group that her father was a part of in their town. The videos came with a question, asking, "Doesn't this look like your dad?" The video showed a runner, crumpled on the ground, with white foam coming out of his mouth. And it did look like her dad, so much so that she showed her mom, and they were both grief-stricken, thinking that he was a victim in the race. But then they realized it wasn't her dad, so they were happy again, until they would later find out that even though that video wasn't her dad, Mr. Liu was a victim too. They got on the next flight out to Beijing, and at the funeral home, they mourned with the other runners' families. Except when she wanted to go console the other women grieving, officials would follow her every step of the way and told her that they should call them if they had any concerns and not to contact the other families. This sparked a lot of rumor and conspiracy that I'll get back to later, but with more than 1,600 rescue workers, over 200 rescue vehicles, and more than 9,000 units of rescue equipment, people wanted answers on what the heck happened during the Ultramarathon. So an hour and a half after the event started, with most of the contestants wearing shorts and no jackets, nothing to keep them warm, it started raining. By noon, a majority of the runners were between checkpoints 2 and 4, which had roughly about 9 miles between both checkpoints. They get about 7,000 feet in the air in that area, and around 1 o'clock, the temperature dropped to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4 degrees Celsius, near checkpoint 3. The average wind force in the area could reach up to 38 miles per hour, and on that day, it got up to 54 miles per hour. That's stronger than the force needed to shake trees and break off twigs. That type of force can cause structural damage to buildings. It's slight structural damage, but can you imagine when strong enough to chip off buildings, is hitting you while you're wearing shorts, thousands of feet in the air. On top of that, the rain turned to hail, and then there was the sand. And under all of those conditions, the runner's body temperature dropped to below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 degrees Celsius for my Celsius people. Interestingly enough, the weather forecast the night before actually said that it would not be a hot day the day of the race. The city's weather center actually issued the lowest grade of a 4-grade wind warning and stated that in the next 24 hours, Beiyang, Zhengtai, and a few other places would have average wind speeds that will reach up to 31 miles per hour, with strong gusts of up to 38 miles per hour. And it would be accompanied by yellow dust and sand, a drop of temperature, and some precipitation. The warning also said that everyone needed to be aware of sudden heavy showers, hail, lightning, and gusts, since it was May and instability in the atmosphere was getting strong in general. Unfortunately, the event organizers didn't pay attention to risk prevention, and after receiving that special report and warning before the race, they didn't take appropriate action, like including windproof and warm equipment in accordance with the standards for high-altitude events. The supply points were also unreasonably set up, and there was no medical aid or supply point in the most difficult and dangerous area of the entire race. They didn't take measures to improve communication conditions, considering the giant blind spot of self-service. Also at the most dangerous area in the race, there were no emergency plans or security measures in accordance with regulations, and it was determined that the emergency rescue preparations were seriously inadequate. And obviously, the early rescue coordination was poorly organized and lacked a sense of urgency. And according to the incident report on this catastrophe, the party committee and municipal government and organizations involved didn't hold any kind of special meeting to study the event. They just issued an activity plan 3 days before the start of the races, so it wasn't enough time to properly prepare for the relevant departments. And even though they did prepare insufficiently, they didn't actually issue the implementation plan that they created. So different departments didn't actually know what they were responsible for. So the people responsible for safety and security didn't actually formulate an emergency response or security plan. And actually, there was a negligent level of staff shortage because the ratio made it so that 11 staff members were responsible for 43 event tasks. At one point, there was one person who was responsible for 9 things. Pretty much the lack of proper planning and organization put them behind in preventing what happened, and then left them hopelessly behind in the initial rescue attempt. They didn't even bother deploying the emergency rescue forces in the plan that they made, just social rescue forces to perform security and rescue work through verbal agreements. So pretty much reaching out to anyone they could get on the phone after the situation was a full-blown emergency, and asking for help that should have already been on standby to now come out and help hours after the fact. And to be frank, the giant lack of workers, supplies, and ways to reach checkpoint 3 is practically criminal. To have a 9-mile, 14-kilometer stretch of land with no one stationed there, and it's the most difficult section and it takes hours to reach, it's a criminal level of negligence or ignorance, whichever you prefer to believe, and everyone else felt the same, because once word got out about the deaths, there was a lot of outrage. Most were against the organizers of the Ultramarathon, which was the local government, and a lot was towards the runners. A lot of people on the internet were saying it was because of inexperienced runners chasing a new fad and biting off more than they can chew, which wasn't completely wrong. In 2019, there were 1,800 marathons, when just 5 years before that, there were only 51. Initial reports didn't say who the fatalities were, so everyone assumed it was a bunch of inexperienced people who had no business racing in something so extreme. It didn't help that in the fallout of everything, a bunch of scheduled races were canceled. And with the families of the victims prevented from talking to each other and kept from talking to the media or taking the remains back home, allegedly to be able to take their family members home, they had to be cremated. They couldn't bring them home without doing that. Things only got worse when an anonymous runner reported that most of the runners dropped out of the race before the organizers officially stopped it and let everyone know that in the future, anyone competing should be ready to look after themselves in case of an emergency. They said, quote, "You can only say you finished if you make it home. Safety always comes first." End quote. Another survivor of the race said that trail running is the same as mountain climbing, and you have to make plans for the worst case scenario every single time, because you can't pin your hopes on others. She placed her survival on preparation because she brought warm clothes and ensured she would have enough time to descend when the weather got worse. Someone else said when they handed over their warm gear, it's because they were expecting to make it back to checkpoint 6 before dark like they always do. That same runner had an emergency blanket with him and said that it took him 20 minutes to open it up. And he was struggling the whole time, and when he finally got it open, it was ripped out of his hands by the wind. And that entire time, he was repeatedly pressing the emergency button on his GPS. He said, quote, "I lost control of my hands and feet. I could only crawl, keep climbing, keep climbing. I told myself that I can't stop. Must keep my body temperature, stay alive, and see my family." End quote. He ran into 6 or 7 other runners also struggling to hold on, and he urged them to keep moving, but they just couldn't. And at some point, he lost consciousness himself and woke up in the hospital. He later learned that rescuers didn't get to him until 7 o'clock that night. So when word got out that Liang Jing, the champion runner and legend, died, there was outrage. Along with a Paralympian who, even though he was hearing and speech impaired, he won the men's hearing impaired marathon and the 2019 National Paralympic Games. His friends described him as a sensitive man whose greatest joy in life was running. When he was last seen, he was between 2 checkpoints and still running, but in bad shape. So there was even more outrage. More survivors spoke out, and one said that there was nowhere to rest and you couldn't stop on the exposed mountains. So the runners in front, all they could really do was keep running to try and get out of it, to try and get to somewhere where they could shelter. And there were these little abandoned shelters along the route. But a lot of those who were found dead were found in them, because without their warm weather gear and without a supply point at checkpoint 3, they had nothing to help keep them warm. They were hardly shelters in the sense that they were still exposed to the outside and the wind could still reach them. It came out that the mandatory equipment list only had emergency blankets as a requirement, and windbreakers and thermal tops were only recommendations. When the criminal charges were dropped, less than 3 weeks after the Ultramarathon, officials said that 31 people would be held responsible, and that the leader of the county where the Ultramarathon was held died in a fall from a high-rise building. That leader was Mr. Lee, and he was determined primarily responsible for the race's high death toll, as he was the one who fell under unclear circumstances that Wednesday. The death brought the death toll of the marathon to 22, and allegedly it happened after he was called in for questioning with the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection and pointed to as the one who should bear the main responsibility of leadership. His death wasn't ruled a homicide, but it wasn't labeled as a suicide either. It was hinted at, though. Apparently, it's common for officials to be under surveillance or detained during initial investigations of disasters. But officials wouldn't say if Mr. Lee was being watched by the authorities at the time of his fall, which apparently happened at his home. So do with that information what you will, but Mr. Lee was posthumously exempted from the charges. 5 employees of the company that organized the Ultramarathon would face criminal charges, and 26 local party officials were disciplined, which included administrative warnings. Some people lost their jobs, and criminal investigations were opened into others. With how fast everything moved, people were quick to point out that local leaders always became the scapegoats when disasters occurred. When Mr. Li was made the Communist Party chief of Jingtai County in 2015, it was the same year that the president of China pledged to end poverty within 5 years. And since 24% of the population of Jingtai were living in poverty around that time, it became a main focus for Mr. Li. Under Mr. Li, Jingtai built solar farms and fishery zones that employed poor residents. Over 3,000 people moved from the mountain villages to flat areas so they could work in factories. And they also kind of rebranded and presented themselves as an ancient Silk Road town where visitors could sightsee. So the races helped to bring Mr. Li closer to the president's goal. And since a lot of local governments were also doing races, they were tied with rural tourism, fighting poverty, and the Healthy China policy. So they were endorsed by China's president. As far as the Gansu Ultramarathon, China's central government and state-owned media said local officials put profits over safety. On the other hand, the provincial government investigators said that it all fell on a lack of planning. All ultramarathons were banned, along with other types of long-distance extreme races across China, because there isn't a national governing organization for those types of events. A lot of the survivors that only survived because they turned back all said at the time of turning back, they really regretted it. They thought to themselves, how can you give up making at least the finishing prize? But after they realized what happened to everyone who continued on, they were grateful that they decided to turn around. And that's what happened in the Gansu Ultramarathon. Let me know what you think and stay safe. I'll be back next Thursday.